in the 20th century, 21st century, the patriarchy, I feel, has combined also with market capitalism to create some particularly poor models of cities that do not work very, very well for women or for anyone for that matter.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist, a podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Dorina Pojani, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Queensland in Australia in urban planning, and she has a lot of experience in the urban planning and urban design fields, both in practice and as an academic, and she's studied the topic in the global north and global south. Her latest book is called Trophy Cities, a feminist perspective on new capitals, and that's the topic we're talking about today, which is about taking a feminist or an eco-feminist approach to looking at urban design. We look at it in this episode through the lens of new capital cities that were designed and built from scratch for countries. But really there are principles in here for all kinds of urban design, small and large scale developments. Why are we talking about feminism? That's a term that maybe makes people feel a little bit unwary or not really sure what we're going to get into here. It's not about bashing men. Dorina makes a really good summary of her perspective on feminism here.
To me, a matriarchy is a situation where there is equality in society, there is equality between genders, all genders, and there is also economic equality, because one cannot really have a perfect matriarchy the way I envision it if there are social inequalities there. I mean, if there are rich women at the top and poor men at the bottom, I don't see where the gain is. I see that as just the patriarchy with another name.
So this is a really interesting perspective that obviously you don't get to hear much in mainstream discussions about urban design and planning. Just on a personal note, I've now actually gone back to education myself. I'm studying part-time for an MSc master's degree in sustainability and ecology at the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales. So I'm doing that part-time, I'm working part-time, I'm doing this podcast, I'm doing various other things. So bear with me over the next, year or two if sometimes episodes are late, if there's gaps between episodes, or if I'm recording these introductions as I am now, a bit hastily and without much of a script, just to get it out. But yeah, we'll definitely still be keeping the podcast going, and I'm still recording lots of interesting conversations with people. Okay, enjoy the conversation. So thank you so much, Dorina, for joining me on the Green Urbanist podcast. It's really good to have you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Please, can you just introduce yourself?
I am a lecturer and researcher in urban planning. I work at the University of Queensland in Australia, but that's not where I'm originally from. I come from Albania, a little country on the Adriatic in the Balkan Peninsula. And I'm here because I've written a book on new capital cities that have been master planned to be capitals in the 20th century and the 21st century.
Thank you. What's your background? Are you a geographer or a planner?
I'm an urban planner, and I consider myself a physical planner, to be more specific. This is the most traditional branch of urban planning, and my research covers a variety of aspects. I do a lot around sustainable urban transport. I care a lot about urban aesthetics, urban design, and I'm also involved in projects on urban housing, especially housing for groups that are in more vulnerable positions and as well as informal housing in the global south.
Okay, great. So we wanted to talk today because you have a new book out, which is called Trophy Cities, which is really really good. And thanks for sending me a copy. It's I'm really enjoying it. Can you tell us what is the premise of that book? Why did you write it?
Well, I myself come from a new capital city. The capital of Albania, Tirana, is a new city. It didn't become capital until the 1920s. It was just a large village before then. So I have personal experience in the topic. And at some point in my life, I became a US citizen, and the United States also have a purpose-built capital, Washington, D.C. I did not include that in the book because it's an earlier master planned capital, and I did not include um, Albania's capital because I've written so much about it already. But I did include in the book Canberra because the country I live in now also has a master planned capital. So once I saw Canberra, I thought, this is a really strange city. What about other capitals, new capitals? Are they as strange or are they any better? And so I decided to research the topic in depth, and I went around the world. I did 7 case studies in total in various continents, and I found out that yes, unfortunately, most new capitals are as strange as Canberra.
So the under or the subline of your book is a feminist perspective on new capitals. Um, what where did that come from, and why is that the approach you've taken?
Well, after I looked at these cities and I saw how unusual they were, none of them could be called a real city, so to speak. So it got me thinking, why should that be so? What are these failures due to? And I kept thinking, does this have to do with race? Because race gets blamed for a lot of things nowadays, right? But failures were evident in countries with white majorities, with black majorities, with Asian majorities. So I didn't think really it had to do with race. And then I thought about religion, but then again, um, new capitals are not good, whether the nation has adopted Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or any variety in between. And then I thought, well, does it have to do with the governance system? Is it that dictatorships create worse cities and democracies create better cities? And that was not the case either. So I kept looking at all these factors. Is it wealthy countries versus poorer countries? No, that wasn't the case either. And then it dawned on me that the thread that connected all these cities was the patriarchy. So all of them have been created under patriarchal systems, and that's what has created all of these failures. And to be clear, patriarchy has been a mainstay for human societies for centuries. So we have gems out there like Venice in Italy, Varanasi in India, and those were created under patriarchal systems for sure. But in the 20th century, in 21st century, the patriarchy, I feel, has combined also with market capitalism to create some particularly poor models of cities that do
Hmm.
not work very, very well for women or for anyone for that matter.
So it's something about planning a city from scratch that is sort of incredibly difficult to get right, and it seems like we have far more poor examples than we have good examples. I guess it's not
Exactly.
unique to capital cities.
No, no, new cities are tough to crack to get them right. And one big problem has been that most designs have been imposed top down on populations, whether they wanted those cities or not. Much better approach would be to co-create cities, just get together with the local population or a future population that might live in a place and just get to the drawing board and ask people what they really want out of their city, as opposed to some star designer, star architect coming in, often from abroad. That's been the case in the new capitals that I've studied, and creating some grand master plan, often with some parade ground in the center for displays of state power. That's not the kind of thing we need in the 21st century, for sure. In fact, I may even question whether we need new capitals and new cities. Existing cities have a fair amount of problems, so why not concentrate scarce resources in solving existing problems rather than um, going and sort of attacking the wilderness, wild nature somewhere else?
Yeah, I think that you're right that it is still an ongoing issue, isn't it? Because I mean, the most high profile one I've seen recently is the new capital of Indonesia moving from Jakarta, where it is now, which is a mega city with lots of problems, not least because it's sinking and while sea levels are rising, so it's under huge threat of flooding, and a lot of the city basically disappearing underwater. But it seems like the government is sort of picking up and just moving into the inland, into the rainforest, and it's unclear what happens to all the people who get left behind when you do that.
Exactly. All the people that get left behind, and it will be the majority of people that currently live in Jakarta, the new capital, which will be created in Borneo, the Indonesian part of Borneo, will only hold maybe 1 million people, but Jakarta,
Mm,
the metro region, is 30 million and counting.
wow.
So the new capital won't really make a dent there. So what will happen to those people? And then the other question is, what will happen to the orangutans that now live in the
Mm,
rainforest? Why do we need to make life better for humans while making it worse for other species? Why do we have this kind of mentality that nature should be dominated, humans are better than other animals and better than plants? I see that as problematic, and I also see it as a reflection of the patriarchy in city building, right? This understanding of um, relationships as hierarchies, where one thing is
mm.
better than the other rather than all things being equal, as in men being better or stronger than women, humans being better or stronger than other animal species, and so on and so forth.
Let's go back a bit to your case studies, and let's talk a little bit about, I guess, what are some of the common issues that you found across them, because they are all over the world and in very different contexts. So it's interesting to see that you found similar issues with all of them.
Yeah, so none of them, I mean, to connect it to my feminist theme, my feminist perspective. So none of these cities really made gender the centerpiece of design. In some cases, for example, in Chandigarh and in Brasilia, which are mid-century, mid-20th century type of cities, there was this notion that we want to create a more egalitarian city. There were all these socialist ideas thrown around in those countries at the time. But none of the cities ever said that, oh, this will be a gender egalitarian new city. And new capitals are the seat of government, right? So there were all these government bureaucracies that were being moved into these new cities. And those bureaucracies, in pretty much all cases, have huge gender imbalances. So nowhere did the fathers, and when I say the fathers, I mean, I say it on purpose because it was usually male politicians and male designers. So the fathers of these new cities never said that, okay, now we'll have equality in government and then have that equality being reflected in city space. We do have the case of Sejong, which is the new administrative capital of South Korea. Seoul remains the sort of real spiritual capital of the country, but most of the government
Mm.
has moved to Sejong already, which not a lot of people know. And in that case, so that's the newest case study I include in the book. In that case, the city makers said that they did want to make this new capital of paradise for women, but what they really meant, if we look at the results, what they really meant is make a city that's good for mothers and housewives, not necessarily
Mm,
for working women. Even there, gender imbalances in the workplace, and the workplace is mostly government in that context, so
mm.
imbalances are huge.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So it really comes down from the perspective level of the either conscious or unconscious bias that women are somehow separate to men and playing different roles.
Exactly. That's exactly my definition of the patriarchy. I mean, it's not simply the fact that women get paid less in the workplace. We know that they do, and women still have um, different responsibilities to men in the workplace and in the family. So we know all of that. But my definition is broader and sort of more metaphorical, so to speak. The way I
Mm,
see it is whole nations are conceived as patriarchies in the sense that there are these hierarchies in the nation with a male president or prime minister or monarch, premier at the top, and then all the levels farther down. So just the way the family is conceived as a patriarchy with the father at the top and then the mother kind of subservient to the father and the children underneath mother and father. So our family structure is um, a pyramid. That's how we have created our government structures. We reflect it. That's set up in the various states that govern us. So that's
mm.
why I talk about patriarchy a lot in the book. It's not just the urban space, but is our government system.
What were and what are, I suppose, these new capitals trying to achieve?
I think that in many cases, they have been little more than vanity projects
Okay.
for a particular leader or a particular government in an area. In some cases, we see this very, very clearly. For example, in Nur Sultan, the new capital of Kazakhstan, there is the imprint of the previous president, the previous Kazakhstan president, who was an elected president, but he governed for 30 years. He kept winning elections with very, very high vote landslide elections. So in that case, we very clearly see his imprint all over the city. In
Mm,
fact, there are also these sort of urban myths created about different buildings in the city. Supposedly, the shape of the building came to him. He just sketched it quickly on um, tissue, and then the architect took that little sketch and developed it in a whole building. So there are these, yeah, I don't know how believable these sorts of myths are, but I guess you need to have some kind of creation myth, right, if you're engaging in some big project. And in other cases, we don't see a particular individual being so connected to the city, but there is a government that has pushed for a project. For example, in Naypyidaw, the capital of Myanmar, Burma, and Abuja, the new capital of Nigeria, these were created by military juntas, pretty much. So
mm.
they were military projects, and the military, we know it's a very male dominated environment. So that's definitely reflected in the urban spaces of those cities. For example, in Naypyidaw, even the housing for the bureaucrats is color coded according to rank in the government
Mm,
bureaucracy. So that's a very military conception of a city, right? And in Abuja, the president's villa, where the president lives, but also holds a lot of the functions. I haven't seen this with my own eyes because access is very restricted, but they say the whole underground is sort of this maze of bunkers for protection and these sorts of things that dictatorships tend to do. And there is a main square in the city that was meant to be this public space. The notion of public space, coming from ancient Greece, the egalitarian space where people meet and greet and meet their leaders. And instead, even that's turned into military space for parade grounds, surrounded by barbed wire. So
oh wow.
that's, yeah, so that's the kind of things we see in places created by military juntas.
Yeah, I suppose when you when you frame it like that, and you tell sort of the history and the origin of where these places come from, it's really no surprise that they don't work for people on a day-to-day basis, because it's sort of ideology first rather than practical life first.
Absolutely. And I mean, look at Canberra too, because I don't want to make it sound as if it's only the global south that comes
Mm.
up with these models, whereas the global north, things are great and the global north is a role model. That's hardly the case. So if I can be a bit critical of the Australian situation as well, I think I can, because I recently became a citizen. So now I'm allowed to criticize my own country. But in Canberra, we see the patriarchy reflected in the fact that the whole government district is quite separate from all the other city spaces. And to me, that sends this subtle message that the government is sort of on top of the people. There is
Mm.
this huge parade grounds. It's hard to get from building to building where all the um, sort of representative spaces are, and then to get to the suburbs where normal people live, well, including bureaucrats, I mean, people that work in government, one needs to either walk for hours or drive.
Mm.
That's how Canberra has been set up.
I guess I guess a to play devil's advocate and sort of, I suppose, tease this out a bit, also for listeners who are maybe um, hear the word feminism and think and get a little bit like defensive,
Mm.
for the men that are listening who are thinking like, is this, are we getting blamed for everything? Is this, I suppose, how do you, as a, when you're researching this kind of thing, how do you tease out whether something is patriarchal, or is it because of a particular political ideology, or a military, perspective, or that kind of thing? I suppose, where do you?
It all comes down to my definition of a matriarchy, right? Let's look at it the other way around. What would
Mm.
a matriarchal society be? So, some people, when they hear the word, they think a matriarchy is a society where women are on top. So, we just have a role reversal. Um, Men are treated the way women are treated now, and then women are kind of on top and barking orders at everyone. To me, that's not a matriarchy, just a nightmare or a hellscape. To me, a matriarchy is a situation where there is equality in society, there is equality between genders, all genders, and there is also economic equality, because one cannot really have a perfect matriarchy the way I envision it if there are social inequalities there. I mean, if there are rich women at the top and poor men at the bottom, I don't see where the gain is. I see that
Mm.
as just the patriarchy with another name.
Mm.
So I hope that clarifies things a bit about what I mean when I talk about the feminist city.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I can definitely understand that. And I think when we've all been living within patriarchal societies for so long, it can be difficult to actually see for what it is and recognize that there are alternatives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And the alternatives, I feel that we need to envision together in the future, as opposed to having um, politicians sort of bully us into particular models, or even designers kind of pushing down particular visions that they might have. People need to get together and decide what society they need to live in, whether
Mm.
the current societies, which I'm calling them patriarchies, are satisfactory, what have those done for us, or whether we need new models going towards the future. And same thing for the city. People need to get together and figure out together what the shape of the cities of the future should be. We shouldn't let, I already mentioned politicians, but we shouldn't let technology companies decide for us either.
This is so relevant, I think, to probably everywhere in the world. And I mean, I'm in the southeast of England here, and there's just so much development happening. It's tens of thousands of homes being designed and built every year. And it isn't new cities in that sense, but what it is often huge extensions to existing towns and villages, and cities. And so I imagine the same sort of issues apply when we don't include the and in that situation you already have an existing community that you should be involving and drawing on. But so often the model is still to have a master planner and a master developer who is basically leading the whole process and will involve the community as little as possible because they're seen as a liability.
Of course. And so in that case, instead of the government calling the shots or technology companies calling the shots, it seems like it's capital, pure and simple, that's making decisions on behalf of everyone else, making urban decisions. So that practically means capital deciding how people should live.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I think we really need to think about whether that is the best. I mean, people are in many ways rightly worried about governments uh, being too involved with design and development, but equally, are we comfortable with the market taking that role and deciding for us?
I like small communities to take a leading role in deciding what their area should look like. I'm not a big believer in big government. I'm not a big believer in big market either. So mm, that's the model. That's the radical model I have in
Mm.
mind.
Yeah, it's something that has been popping up a lot for me lately in conversations I've been having on the podcast, but also in books I've been reading. Is is this sort of moving to a much more localized mindset? Because I think, and it'd be interesting to actually to see if you agree with this, but it seems like a lot of the urban design of new capitals and other new cities around the world has been driven by globalization. So North American and European models being exported to locations where they're just not, it's just not appropriate to do that. And I see that a lot in the Middle East. I mean, somewhere like Saudi Arabia, there's just so much huge amount of development, and it really doesn't look like traditional Arabian architecture or urbanism.
I was just going to say that's a local that's a real shame that a lot of heritage is being lost, right?
Mm,
North looks same as south, east looks the same as west, and we see that in buildings, but also we see that in people's clothes, and food is becoming more and more globalized. So
yeah,
the spirit of place is getting diluted.
yeah, yeah. So I think I hope there is a push towards taking a much more localized um, understanding of place, and I think also designers and developers having more of a stake in the local area, because it's quite easy just to design something from 100 1,000 kilometers away, and maybe you visit the site once and then you never show up again afterwards. That's not really how we should be designing places.
Exactly. I mean, we should be designing places based on a person's range of transport on foot or by bicycle. I see that as being the proof there. That's just about the range we can comprehend. We're human. uh, Homo sapiens were small, and it's not as if we were meant to live in these enormous settlements with large scale comprehensive planning. We were meant to live sort of in small tribes, and I don't think we've evolved past that, even though we pretend like we have. I mean, that's perhaps why we keep creating such bad cities, large cities.
I totally agree with that. Let's talk about, I suppose, the relationship between maybe this sort of patriarchal approach to urbanism and climate change. What's the interplay of that?
Well, in the new capital cities that I studied, I saw that this theme of trying to tame and dominate wild nature was a constant. So the new capitals were created in these most inhospitable spaces and places, like Nur Sultan, the capital of Kazakhstan I mentioned earlier, was created in the steppe, in the arid steppe of Asia, with very, very cold temperatures in winter. It never goes above freezing in winter. In fact, the average high, I think, is minus 10 or 11.
Wow.
So I ask, why should we be putting a new city in that kind of natural environment? I mean, that's not a place that fosters human well-being. In fact, not too far from where the new capital was created were the Soviet gulags, where people
Mm,
used to live, unfenced prisons, but unfenced because it was so cold, no one could escape and go
wow.
anywhere. Then we have two cases located in savanna environments. The capital of Nigeria, Abuja, and the capital of Brazil, Brasilia. They were created on virgin land in the savanna, the African savanna and the Brazilian savanna. So why do we need to attack nature in that manner? And in the
Mm,
case of Brasilia, because the government wanted to build the city very quickly, they wanted to get it done in 5 years, while the president that created the city push for the patron was in power.
mm.
So what they did was, instead of trying to integrate nature and building, they just cleared the whole site. They
Oof.
cut all the trees that were there, and then once the city was built, they brought in new trees to be planted. But a lot of new trees weren't even savanna type of trees. They brought them from Rio de Janeiro, because
Mm.
that's where most nurseries were. I mean, that was in Sao Paulo. Those are both um, tropical, subtropical kind of environments, so just completely new vegetation. Then we have the case of Naypyidaw in Myanmar, in the middle of the jungle, just clearing the jungle to build these big highways, um, concrete, a lot of concrete in this new city. They even moved, so in Naypyidaw, they even moved the zoo animals from the old capital Yangon. So the animals were made to transfer to the new capital, and that includes, oddly enough, penguins.
Oh
So
my
now
god.
they've got penguins in the jungle. Sometimes I wonder, maybe I should have called the book, I should have given it the title Penguins in the Jungle. Then it would be,
The absurdity.
yes.
Oh my god. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, what sort of timescales are a lot of the capitals you studied in the sort of um modernist time frame? Because I imagine that is a very, that sort of, conquering of nature is it seems like a modernist perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, modernism as a movement has a lot to answer
Mm.
um, for. And yes, on purpose, I picked new capitals that were built in the 20th and 21st centuries, because that's when we see these greater disasters. Capitals that were created earlier um, are less arrogant, perhaps, in their dealings with nature. There was
Mm.
more of an effort to integrate with nature, create designs that were more organic, partly because the technology was lacking to attack nature at such a large scale. We later saw in the 20th and 21st centuries. Yeah.
Because even now, I think when we there's an understanding from designers that they need to take a more ecological approach, and at least need to be seen to be creating places that are very green and integrate, with the surrounding natural environment. But I'm very skeptical of how much of that is greenwashing and how much of it is actually well thought through. And I come back to the CGIs I've seen of the new capital of Indonesia, which very well may just be concept drawings, but they sort of show this idea of a city that's just nestled into the rainforest and barely making an impact at all. But actually, I just don't see how you can have that much concrete and that much hard paving and everything without having just a really destructive impact on local ecology. So
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And I mean, think of all the underground infrastructure that will be put in place as well. So all the sewer lines and electricity lines and all of that stuff. So the jungle will be affected, not just the surface level, but the underground level. So all the water that's underground might end up polluted if things aren't done right. And then think also of the above ground. So what air pollution will all the new
Mm,
construction cause,
yeah.
and then even the visual pollution. I mean, new cities always have these overhead wires going on, so we'll have that in the visuals of the jungle. So that alone tells you that the impact will be huge. But let me tell you about the case of South Korea, because that's already done. I mean, when it comes to the new capital of Indonesia, we're speculating to some extent because
Yes.
it hasn't happened yet. But Sejong is already there, and that was created as a prototype of a U-Eco city. That's a
Mm,
Korean concept. U stands for ubiquitous, and a ubiquitous city is the ultimate smart city, right? Where
mm.
the Internet of Things, everything is connected. Your phone is connected to your garbage collection, and your fridge talks to your TV, and all of that stuff. So after that was decided, a new capital was going to be a ubiquitous city, partly as a promotion for the Korean IT industry. I mean, we know the nation is strong on that, is world leader.
Mm.
So that was sort of a cooperation between that industry and city building. Then the appellate green city was sort of added on, which connects to what you're saying about greenwashing. But in the end, a lot of the new city development was about economic development that came first, and
Mm.
then the eco credentials were sort of tagged on later to make this an appealing concept. This new city may make it appealing in the 21st century.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. It does often feel like an additional layer afterwards. I've been reading a book that has been really interesting. It's called Darwin Comes to Town.
Oh, okay.
How urban, I think it's how cities drive evolution, or how urban places drive evolution, and it's an ecologist, biologist, who talks about the ways that species who have been able to live and thrive in cities have actually faced such evolutionary pressure in that new environment that many of them have literally changed and literally evolved in a very short time period. Is really, really interesting. And he makes the argument that cities are, of course, not the same ecosystem of the surrounding, countryside, but they're also not one type of ecosystem. They're more like an archipelago of different ecosystems. And he says that, particular parks. So in London, we have these large, royal parks, and a large park in itself is one type of ecosystem, which for which the species that live there will be adapted to an extent that will be genetically different to another large park that may only be 10 miles away or something like that. And then you have all the little spaces in between. So, for instance, little pockets of green along railway tracks actually can be quite biodiverse. But again, it's a very specific type of ecosystem that only particular species will be predisposed to live there. And it really opened my eyes to the idea that, I think, first of all, I think urban designers, planners, architects don't get the training or enough training in ecology to really understand these things. And it's something that I'm only now exploring. But also the fact that, we need to consider all the other living things that make a home in cities that aren't humans, and consider, not only what they can do for us, of which is a lot, but also just how can we, give them a good home as well within cities.
That's so true. And also, it's about how to make cities as compact as possible so we're not interfering too much with their habitats outside of cities. Because,
Yeah,
I mean, I do understand the point that all kinds of creatures, perhaps including us, evolve living in the city, learn to cope with noise and pollution and high speeds and visual interference
yeah,
and all of that. But the ideal is to let other species do their thing in the wilderness rather than us going and interfering with their habitats and hoping that they'll evolve to to accommodate our needs, right? But no, it's true that ecology needs to become a much bigger part of urban planning, even in the way we train our students. And often I get asked when we have open days at my university here in Australia, high school seniors come in and their parents, and they ask me, well, what is urban planning all about? Because they're deciding what they
mm.
want to study in the future. And I tell them, urban planning is about everything because cities are about everything, and that includes other animals in addition to humans.
That is so true, so true. It's an endless list of the things that planners need to think about. Um, so I guess you've talked a little bit about what might be a kind of alternative approach. How do you, which would be maybe a more matriarchal approach to urbanism? It seems like so much of how we design is wrapped up in our the systems of society, our political systems within capitalism. I suppose, how do you see a way forward for maybe bridging to a more matriarchal, equal, ecological sort of urbanism? It seems like a very, very tough journey, I think, to get there.
It's a tough journey for sure, and I don't see how urban planning alone could be the fix. I feel like we need to change our societies towards um, more equality before urban planning can reflect that equality. That's what I see as a first step. If we wanted to take just some immediate steps to help women as these longer term processes happen, well, we need to make cities more convenient for women to navigate, and we need to make them safer for women to navigate. We need to also improve our economic system so that women have access to all kinds of employment, including professions that work close to them in the future. And once they enter those professions, make sure that they're paid the same way as men, because then that changes women's outcomes in the city. If women aren't paid enough, then they won't have access to good enough housing for themselves and their families. They won't have access to good enough transport or even good enough sanitation, those basic things that human beings need to thrive.
Mm. So it's a perspective shift and a ideology shift that comes first, and maybe the urban form will follow.
Yes, that's how I see it.
So there's a final question that I always ask guests. Basically, we're in this sort of critical decade in terms of taking action on climate change. So I always want to get the perspective of guests of over the next 10 years or so. From your perspective, what do you think needs to happen? And it may be that you've already answered part of this, but it's always nice to get a chance to reiterate.
Well, look, in the past, these kind of movements like feminism or even environmentalism itself, they were sort of fringe movements, right? It was only certain people that embraced them. And I see them as a combination, by the way. I myself consider myself to be an eco-feminist, so someone who cares both about gender equality and the environment. I think both are important in achieving a more just future. But in the past, both these movements were sort of fringe movements. It was
Mm,
only kind of the hippies that were involved, and in the future, we simply cannot continue in that way. All of these fringe movements now need to become not just mainstream, but the most important movements in our society to improve our governance systems and our cities. There is no time anymore for sort of seesaw approaches and saying that, oh, things will be okay. We always managed to get out of the woods in the past. No, we won't if we don't do something about it now.
Excellent, excellent. I think that's a great final word. Where can people find out more about you and your book?
Um, the best place is probably my university profile. If you visit that, there are links to everything that I've written.